we're off to a great start. Who's next?
Yes, thank you, Carson. Thank you, Ghazali. Yes, our next guest is Professor Megan Davis from the Indigenous Caucus in Australia. She is a Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous and Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales. Also, member of the UNEMRIP, former member to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She's a constitutional lawyer who was a member of the Referendum Council and the experts panel on the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples in the Constitution. She is also a commissioner on the Australian Rugby League Commission. Megan supports the North Queensland Cowboys and the Queensland Maroons. Nice.
Yeah. Full disclosure. I'm not a league. I'm not a league person. I'm more of a union. But I think that we can because you have two codes, right? In rugby, you have league and you have union.
Very different codes. Very different.
Sorry about that. Full disclosure. Megan Davis. We talk. There's one video that goes around the internet, goes on around YouTube and Facebook about that NRIP when we talked about the legally binding nature of the declaration, which was a very good tag team that we did from the floor and the expert mechanism. Yeah. And in my view, that is how the indigenous peoples and experts members should be interacting. We'll definitely talk more about that. We started talking about rugby. You're indigenous lawyer, Snapchat, indigenous Instagram connoisseur, law professor, commissioner of NRL, which is pretty left field for many of our colleagues out there, but makes sense to you. What's your vision and approach to achieve that vision?
Do you mean in terms of rugby league or just my work?
Both.
Yeah, no, well, I suppose rugby league's interesting because it's a game that was played very early in Australia's history. It arrived in Australia about 1908. But it was a time where Aboriginal people were segregated. It was a period of racial segregation. And rugby league provided an opportunity for Aboriginal men to leave the reserves or the missions, have permission to leave and go play rugby league with other Australian men. And it was a really interesting and remains so a very interesting part of Aboriginal culture. It's a sport that provided some degree of, or to some extent, emancipatory potential for people that were, when I say for people, virtually every Aboriginal person who was in that, what they call, benignly called the protection era. It's not an uncommon approach that the British Crown took in many of the countries that it colonised, invaded and colonised. And so, yeah, the sport means a lot to me because, my great-grandfather played the sport. I mean, it is the sport that people play in the two biggest populated states in Australia. And so it's played a really important role in terms of reconciliation and race relations in Australia. So, when I was asked to join the board, I was chair of the Permanent Forum at the time and said no because I wouldn't be able to contribute the time that I needed to. But when they came back the second time, I was like, I was nuts to say no the first time. I'm not going to give it up this time.
Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, Megan, what is your Twitter handle? How can people reach you?
I have no idea actually. I think it's something to do with Queenslander, something to do with the state of origin. I think it's Prof. It's not Prof. It's M Davis Queenslander. So MDAVIS QLDER, and Queensland's the state where I grew up.
Okay, thank you so much, because I know the people will definitely quote you on on a lot of things. If people Google you, of course, like the NRL will come up, but Uluru Statement as well. I know that's very dear to you. What is it? What is your relationship in there, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, so the Uluru Statement is the culmination of, a couple of decades of Aboriginal advocacy for constitutional reform, really. I mean, we are an Indigenous people in which the British Crown didn't enter into a treaty. So, we're in 2020 and we don't have any kind of treaty agreement. and no real reckoning or recognition of that original grievance. That is to say, there's been no agreement that has been made between the state and First Nations peoples about sovereignty. And therefore, there's a lot of unfinished business between us and the nation. And so, you know, we don't have a Bill of Rights, we don't have any form of recognition in the Constitution. So one of the things that I think we have been seeking is some form of substantive, concrete constitutional recognition that will provide our people with some power and a basis in which to achieve the rest of the aspirations that we have in terms of treaty and even truth-telling. I mean, you know, we, in terms of the Uluru Statement, believe that the Australian government and successive governments have too readily used truth-telling as a way of, we call it can kicking. But Australian governments have too readily used truth-telling as a way of avoiding substantive structural reform. So that's a really, I think, significant part of the Uluru Statement is what we're calling for is a structural voice. So we want to compel the state to have us at the table on decisions that are made about us in terms of laws and policy. It's something like a duty to consult, but it's a bit stronger than a duty to consult. So that's the Uluru Statement. Vicky, when she was Special Rapporteur, actually came to one of the Uluru Statement dialogues.
Yep.
And wrote about it in one of her reports. But, you know, my time on the UN, Ghazali, you know, 6 years on the forum, I mean, I really started 22 years ago as a little kid when I did the UN fellowship, but I've seen the ways in which other liberal democracies recognise and accommodate Indigenous peoples within the framework of the state. And so this is quite a common way, right? And so it's one that really interests us and fits with the kind of sentiment that we feel about the Australian state, and that is a very strong sense of powerlessness and voicelessness. And so the Uluru Statement is about addressing that.
Oh, awesome. So zooming out a little bit from Australia into like the global, you've 6 years at the Perm Forum and now at NREP. And what are the biggest surprises so far that you see, positive and or negative, on Indigenous rights?
I mean, there's so many answers to that question. I mean, so one surprise, I suppose, post-declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples has been that we, in my view, and we've written a report, and my chair of the NRIP is on the line, Laila. We've written a free, prior, and informed consent report.
Very good report, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. We're surprised in the way that FPIC has surpassed the right to self-determination as being kind of the right that people talk about a lot post-DRIP. And I suppose in our conversations as NRIP experts, we feel like it's been to the detriment of the right to self-determination, which is why we have a report coming up, which we encourage everybody to make submissions to on the right to self-determination. So I suppose that's been interesting in that FPIC has dominated so much of the space. And I suppose that's not necessarily a bad thing, but in some ways it has been picked up by corporations and governments, and we worry about self-determination being reduced to a procedural right, you know, a process issue, as opposed to something much more than that. So that's one thing that I've found surprising. Another thing I've found surprising in the absence of a travaux of the DRIP is a lot of non-Indigenous experts rewriting the meanings of the many, many articles that we drafted during the period of the drafting of the DRIP. And that's an important thing too, because, and certainly the mandate of the NRIP helps, I suppose, address that, and certainly the very important work of the Special Rapporteur in terms of being able to put some meat on the bones of the provisions of the DRIP is really critical, because it's a unique declaration. It's a declaration that came out of, as you know, from COBO right through to all the WGIPs. It's a declaration that was drafted by the rights bearers having, you know, the same kind of status as states, and being able to draft that declaration in response to the issues we raised in the review of developments part of the WGIP's mandate, that's really significant. And so as a public international lawyer, it's frustrating to see non-Indigenous lawyers who have no connection to Indigenous communities, who are, professional academics saying things about particular provisions that they know nothing about. And so that's a really important piece of work that we need to do as Indigenous experts, I think, and as Indigenous peoples attending the UN meetings. You wanted something positive as well?
If you have any.
No, I mean, look, can I say one more bad thing?
Sure, go ahead.
The other thing that I think is worrying sometimes is that we've become accustomed to a lot of UN meetings like Permanent Forum and UNEMRIP, and we're not paying enough attention to the UN human rights treaty bodies.
100%.
And I think there's been a real neglect of that, and that's really problematic because that's substantive law and it makes a big deal. So in terms of positive, look, the one great thing I think about the UN meetings and the UN work is what Tuomas, I think, touched upon, and that is the International Indigenous Global Movement. And that's a really powerful thing, the work that we do on that level. But in particular, the stories we share with each other about what our governments do and things that work well and things that don't work. You pick up so many ideas. And for me as a constitutional lawyer, I just find it fascinating, not just as, my 10 odd years as an expert, but before that, just sitting there at UN meetings and listening, from 10 to 5 or 6, 10 to 6, to everybody's contributions and hearing, whether it's, African states or Scandinavia or Latin America, listening to the very many ways in which states accommodate and recognize Indigenous peoples within the framework of their state, but also the thing, the really crappy things that happen that are going on as well. So that's a positive thing.
No, thank you so much. You talked about declaration. Article 3 is something that we keep on pushing, of course, right to self-determination. What is, in your view, the biggest challenge right now for Indigenous peoples in relation to the right to self-determination?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I suppose I'll touch upon part of the previous answers that I've given, and that is, look, for a long time, the UN wouldn't allow us to use language of the right to self-determination. Yeah, so we learned ways in which to adapt to that. And one way that the NRL dealt with that was to call the reports, the right to participate in democratic decision-making and other things. But I do think post-DRIP, there's been kind of a real focus and emphasis on other aspects, like I've said, FPIC, and perhaps to the detriment of self-determination. We want to know now what it looks like. What does self-determination look like in the many, many countries that contain significant Indigenous populations? And that's really key, because I think we're at a stage of the DRIP where we're really wanting to put some solid meat on the bones of the declaration. What does each provision really actually mean? And just because the state has a particular legislation, if there's been no Indigenous input into that, that doesn't mean that that's okay. And so there's a lot of work, I think there's a lot of work to be done around that.
All right. So, a lot of, the last 10 minutes, a lot of brain candy, nuggets of a lot of things that the people can take on. Something that I really I'm thinking about is that Indigenous peoples are not doing enough outreach about their situations. I see too many press releases, too little contextual content. You're on Snapchat, you're on Instagram, you're on Twitter. Where do you stand on the use of social media?
Am I on Snapchat?
Oh no, Laila is on. Sorry. Laila was on Snapchat.
Oh, sorry. I think I'm only on there with my family, but so I don't think social media is to blame. I think there's been a professionalization of activism to some degree. I think that post adoption of the DRIP, and we have the permanent forum and the expert mechanism, and you have a lot of kind of professional conference goers, and then you have people that a little bit like the WGIP, like people that are desperately turning up to try and get someone to listen to their story. I mean, when you look at the core of that UN work, Indigenous peoples look to the UN because their states were failing in their responsibility to them as citizens, and they were looking to these supranational institutions that had as their normative framework international human rights law, and that history is really critical. But sometimes I sit there in some of the meetings and it's really frustrating. You'll see people come in, give a statement, put out that press release, do a YouTube video and leave. And in the WGIP days, that never happened. People sat in the room and listened to the entire day meeting, if not the whole week meeting. And the same with the declaration. It's respect for other people's and other Indigenous people's stories and narratives and the things that they're going through. So I'm not sure social media is to blame. I just think that there's a circuit. It costs a lot of money. Yeah. So the moment we moved from Geneva to New York, particularly with the forum, we left behind a lot of continents, a lot of countries that can't afford to go to New York and also can't get visas to get into New York. And, so I think, on the Permanent Forum, we used to lament the lack of participation because of funding from the Pacific and also African states. And it's the same with NRL. So, which means that it becomes dominated by states that have high incomes and can afford to go to these meetings, and their issues influence the work of all the bodies. So I'm not sure it's social media that's the problem, actually. But that's a conversation for all of the global Indigenous peoples movement to talk about and discuss, because like I said, I mean, the Indigenous meetings are important, but in terms of the further development and elaboration on our rights, we need to be focusing a lot more in the treaty bodies. And there's a lot of treaties, there's a lot of treaty bodies, and there's a lot of really important work to be done there in terms of mapping out and that's a complex piece of work to accept that. It depends on what the treaty is and what the issue is, etc. But you're going to, it's an important area of international human rights law, and it has a particular influence on states and states' legal systems in the way that NRL and Permanent Forum don't have. So, social media is, there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's great to see people attending things and doing things, but yeah.
No, sorry about the Snapchat thing, by the way. Final 90 seconds. Anything that we didn't touch upon that you would like to talk about? Thoughts, ideas, what comes to your mind?
Nothing at this point because it's midnight, but
sorry about that, by the way.
No. I think we're in an interesting stage. Like I know as NRL, we're really excited about Francisco taking the role of Special Rapporteur, and we think there's a lot of work to be done by NRL and the Special Rapporteur on the elaboration of the declaration. So I think that's really very important for our people across the world. And the only other thing is, just mention again the fact that we need a lot of we need a lot more funding directed to the Pacific and a lot of African states to kind of elevate some of the issues that they need to raise and need to be ventilated at a UN issue at a UN level that just aren't being raised at this point. So that to me is a real, I know NRL and the Permanent Forum share my concerns, but that's a deep concern I have about that.
Appreciate it, Megan. Definitely we'll do a long form conversation at a point that is much more convenient for you. I know it's like late night and on a Friday night, you're probably about to go to party, maybe, I don't know. Thank you so much.
I'm like old days.
Oh, sorry.
I'm an old lady now.
All right. Thank you so much, Megan, and we'll talk soon.
Ini,
how was that?
Wow, that's amazing. Actually, also, Professor Megan, you've seen that she's part of the rugby, into the rugby. I used to play for the national Panamanian team, so as a number 9. So it's amazing to see her and talking about all this thing. And I think I hope a lot of young people there watching us and to see the importance of like being in this war, you know.
You're number
Diplomacy.
9. I was number 9 too.
Really, we need to
Yeah.
make an maybe next time when we meet with the
We should.
games.
Yeah.
So much, yeah.